Clockwork, or All Wound Up, by Phillip Pullman. Part 3. Sir Ironsoul stopped at once with a whir and a click. His sword was inches from Gretel's throat. The prince's song rang out sweetly through the parlour. Gretel could only stare, in horror at Sir Ironsoul and his sword, in wonder at the prince. "Where did you come from?" she said. "Are you the little prince in the story? I think you must be. But how cold you are! And who is this? How sharp his sword is! I don't like him at all. Oh, what must I do? I feel I'm supposed to do something, but I don't know what it is." There was no one to help. She was alone with the two little figures, one all malice, the other all sweetness. Gretel touched the prince's cheek gently and found it cold, but her touch awoke something in his machinery for an instant, and he turned his eyes to hers and smiled. "Oh, you poor thing," she cried. He opened his lips and sang one or two notes. "I know what it is," said Gretel. "You're not well, and I don't like that little knight one bit, and I don't want to leave you here with him. But I know whose fault this is. It was Fritz who made the story up. If only we could find out how it finished." She looked at the stove, where Fritz had thrown the sheets of paper on which his story was written. She had thought they were all destroyed, but crumpled up on the floor in the shadow, there was one piece left unburnt. She picked it up and straightened it out. It was the very page he had been reading when the stranger had come in. On it were the words: "He was very tall and thin, with a prominent nose and jaw. His eyes blazed like coals in caverns of darkness. His hair was long and grey, and he wore a black cloak with a loose hood, like that of a monk. He had a harsh, grating voice, and his expression was full of savage curiosity. And that was the man who—" There was no more. The story stopped at that point. "That was exactly when he came in," said Gretel to herself. But there were another few words scribbled below, and peering closely, she managed to make them out. "Oh, this is impossible. How can I write an ending to this story? I'll have to make it up when I get there, and hope I do it well. If I come up with something good, the devil can have my soul." Gretel's eyes widened, and she bit her lip in horror. People shouldn't say things like that. "Well," she said to herself, "he started it all off, and I'm going to make him finish it. You sit in here and keep warm, Prince Florian, if that's who you really are, and I'll go and fetch Fritz. He's the only one who can sort it out." So she threw on her cloak and set off to the house where Fritz the storyteller had his lodging. Meanwhile, Karl had been preparing the place in the mechanism of the great clock that was set aside for his masterpiece. Feverish with excitement, he hurried down the staircase of the clock tower and across the square to the inn. The old cat, Putsy, was still outside, sitting on the window-sill, watching everything as he licked his paws and cleaned his ears. It was cold out there, and he was wondering about coming in for a snooze by the stove. But Karl didn't notice him. He had other things than cats on his mind. He went in quietly and shut the door, and then he stopped in alarm, for there was the canvas thrown aside, and there was Sir Ironsoul's sword upraised on the other side of the room. Karl's heart missed a beat. Had someone else come in and disturbed the little knight? There was no one dead, at least. But why had the figure moved? Karl looked around, and then he saw the little prince sitting politely in his chair, watching him. 1,000 strange fears ran over his skin. Karl opened his mouth to speak, and then realized that the child wasn't alive after all. It was another clockwork figure like Sir Ironsoul, and a far finer one by the look of it. He peered at it closely. The hair, the finest gold wires he had ever seen, the bloom on the silver cheeks like a butterfly's wing, the eyes, bright blue jewels, almost alive in the way they seemed to look at him. Only Dr Kalmenius could have created this, and he must have brought it for Karl. What did the figure do? Karl reached out and lifted the prince's hand from his lap. With a little flicker of his energy, Prince Florian shook Karl's hand and sang a bar of music for him. Karl's hair stood on end, for an idea had just come to him. Why not put this figure in the clock instead of Sir Ironsoul? It was more finely finished, and a handsome little boy who sang a pretty tune would be far more popular with the crowds than a faceless knight who did nothing but threaten people with a sword. And then he could keep Sir Ironsoul for himself. And then... oh, how his mind raced! He could travel the world. He could become famous, giving exhibitions and demonstrations. He became quite dizzy as he thought of the uses to which he could put the metal knight, the gold he could steal, the forbidden treasures that could be his if he had a secret accomplice, like Sir Ironsoul, who could be relied on always to kill and never to give him away. All he would have to do would be to trick his intended victim into saying the word devil, and leave Sir Ironsoul nearby to play his part. He, Karl, could be somewhere else entirely, playing cards with a dozen witnesses, or even in church, surrounded by the faithful. No one would ever know. So excited did he become that he lost all sense of what was right. The church, his father and mother and brother and sister, Herr Ringelmann, every influence for good he'd ever known was whirled away into the darkness, and all he could see was the wealth and power that would be his if he used Sir Ironsoul in that way. And before he could change his mind, he threw the canvas over the knight, tucked the stiffening figure of Prince Florian under his arm, and set off back to the clock tower.